Curtin.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I rise to speak in favour of the bill, but also to identify some implementation concerns to be considered, which partially align with the amendment proposed by the member for Page. I'm pleased that the Australian Government is recognising the impact of climate change on the frequency of extreme weather events and acknowledging that pre-disaster mitigation is essential in moderating the severity of post-disaster recovery. Natural disasters in Australia have devastating financial and social impacts on individuals, families, local communities, businesses and governments. Australia's 2019-20 Black Summer bushfires were the worst on record, burning through 24 million hectares of land, claiming lives and destroying homes and livelihoods. The subsequent Royal Commission into National Natural Disaster Arrangements in 2020 recognised the contribution of climate change to that event, and that the 2019-20 bushfire season may have provided only a glimpse of the type of events that Australia may face in the future. The floods in south-east Queensland and New South Wales at the beginning of this year were one of Australia's worst recorded flood disasters. Damage from the floods cost more than $1.5 billion, and as of the 8th of March, $282 million in disaster payments had been paid to flood victims, but it still wasn't enough. Right now, the East Coast is experiencing continued significant flooding, with more expected to come. Climate change is here and we are seeing the devastating effects. I commend the Government for acknowledging that Australia's disaster resilience response needs specific funding, and acknowledge that this is a Productivity Commission recommendation in its report into natural disasters, which is supported by local government and disaster relief bodies. But this will only be the start. A recent Deloitte report said natural disasters cost the Australian economy $38 billion per year on average, representing about 2% of Australia's GDP in 2020. Even under a low emissions scenario, if timely action sees emissions start to fall and reach zero by 2100, this cost will rise to at least $73 billion annually by 2060. This puts the current $200 million commitment into perspective. This report suggests that scaling up investments in both physical resilience, such as infrastructure, and community resilience, such as preparedness programs, will be required to reduce the significant anticipated costs from natural disasters, even under a low emissions future. We need to improve coordination and targeting of investments to avoid the impacts on some of the most vulnerable areas in Australia. The $200 million commitment represents 0.5% of the annual cost of natural disasters. It will need to be allocated carefully to create the most impact for the investment, and the amount committed will need to be scaled up commensurate with impact. I note that the funding limit will be reviewed every 5 years. I urge the Government to review this more regularly given the scale of the impact. But it's a good start, and I look forward to watching the space closely and holding Government to account. I also commend the Government for committing $50 million this year for the Coastal and Estuarine Risk Mitigation Program to reduce the impacts of natural disasters and coastal hazards such as storm surges and coastal inundation. But this commitment finishes at the end of this financial year, and the effects of climate change continue to destroy our dune ecosystems. We need to do more to protect these coastal areas. Protecting our coastline is essential for Australia's quest to build resilience and prepare for natural disasters. I urge the Government to make an ongoing allocation for coast care funded from the Disaster Ready Fund. In my electorate of Curtin, there are more than 15 kilometres of coastline stretching from Leighton Beach in the south to Trigg Beach in the north. The estimated cost to Government of managing the 55 identified erosion hotspots could be $110 million over the next 5 years. And so much of this work is being done by passionate community volunteers. Along the stretch in my electorate, we have a number of very active coast care groups, including Cottesloe Coast Care, Cambridge Coast Care and Stirling Natural Environment Coast Care. These groups are made up of passionate members who care about our community and our environment. I've visited them and seen firsthand the effects of climate change on our dunes and beaches and the work they're trying to do to counter that impact. While applications for the Coastal and Estuarine Risk Mitigation Program have already closed, I spoke with Cottesloe Coast Care about how funding our coastline would protect our natural habitat and assist our community. Since 1996, Cottesloe Coast Care has raised funds for fencing to protect fragile sand dunes and to build access walkways to the beach. but the bulk of Cottesloe Coast Care's work is revegetation to increase fore-dune physical resilience and to improve biodiversity. Volunteers hand-remove invasive environmental weeds, collect seeds of local plant species and restore areas, planting, hand-weeding and watering about 100,000 plants in total. More than half of Cottesloe's degraded coastal dunal system has been restored by these efforts. Cottesloe Coast Care has raised funding in excess of $300,000 over 25 years for dune restoration projects, which has been matched by the town of Cottesloe. But so much more can be done. I asked Cottesloe what they could do with federal government grants if the Coastal and Estuarine Risk Mitigation Program were an ongoing program. A grant of $100,000 would fund 2 years of on-ground activity, allowing revegetation of a hectare of degraded coastal land. It's estimated that 5 to 7 hectares of degraded coastal dunes remain on Cottesloe's foreshore. A grant of $1 million would allow the rapid completion of the restoration of Cottesloe's foredunes to nearly original condition, providing physical stability. This work adds to the beauty and amenity of the dunes, but importantly, it allows nature to protect itself from natural disasters. Dune vegetation is the best protection against erosion. We need a sustainable, equitable and efficient funding model to enable the implementation of coastal hazard risk planning, and this could be part of the Disaster Ready Fund. I'd also like to raise some concerns that the bill does not include any details about how this new resilience fund will be allocated. And it seems to confer broad ministerial powers on how to allocate funds without any parliamentary oversight. The bill does not include any details about how projects competing for disaster mitigation funding will be prioritised. I have no doubt there will be disaster mitigation projects proposed all over the country that greatly exceed $200 million. And the varied examples of eligible projects presented by my fellow members show the challenges in defining disaster mitigation. I assume that projects will need to be prioritised according to the value of the mitigation benefit. But is this a financial value, a property value, a life value? And what criteria will be used and who will make these decisions? The lack of clarity about prioritisation criteria and eligibility criteria will create challenges and potentially produce suboptimal outcomes. In conclusion, I support this bill, given that it addresses the specific need to fund disaster resilience efforts. But I strongly urge the government to firstly include coastal hazard management in the funding allocated to the Disaster Ready Fund, and secondly to review the quantum of Disaster Ready Fund, given that it represents only 0.5% of the annual cost to the country of natural disasters. And thirdly, commit to transparency in relation to the allocation of the Disaster Ready Fund, both on the definition of disaster mitigation and the criteria that will be used to prioritise projects. Thank you.
The question is that the